All right.
Okay, let's mute it. אוקיי, ערב טוב לכל מי שהצטרף, או מי שעומד להצטרף. אנחנו תכף נתחיל בוובינר, ובואו נראה, אוקיי, let's see. אוקיי, אנחנו נחכה עוד איזה דקה, אני רואה שאנשים עוד מצטרפים. We'll wait about 1 minute because I see that there's a lot of audiences coming in. אוקיי, אז אני רוצה, קודם כל, כמו שאמרתי, קודם כל תודה שהצטרפתם. אנחנו, רוב הוובינר יהיה באנגלית, כמו שאמרתי. מי שלא מכיר אותי, שלומי מחברת יוניק, ואני מתעסק בפאור בי-איי ובאקסל, גם בהדרכה וגם בפיתוח, ואני שמח בעצם שמליסה הצטרפה אלינו, מליסה קוטס בעצם מצפון קרוליינה, והיא בעצם תעשה לנו את הוובינר הזה. הוובינר הזה היא כמובן תשתף אתכם על מה הוובינר ומה הנושאים, ואני אשמח עכשיו להעביר, הוובינר אגב יהיה משהו בסביבות השעה ורבע, אנחנו משודרים גם בלייב ביוטיוב, ואחר כך ההקלטה גם תופיע בערוץ פאור בי-איי ישראל ביוטיוב. אז אתם מוזמנים גם ללכת לשם, וכמובן לעשות לייק ולרשום הערות, אם יש לכם הערות. אני, במהלך הוובינר, אנחנו תוכלו בעצם לשאול שאלות. אם יש לכם שאלות, אתם יכולים לרשום באנגלית או בעברית, אני אעלה את זה בעצם למליסה, ואני אעדכן אותה שיש שאלות, וגם אתם יכולים לרשום בעברית, ואני אתרגם לה, אין שום בעיה. אוקיי, אז let's get started. Okay, so thank you, Melissa, for joining us on this webinar. I told the audience that we are starting now, and we will be in about 1.25 or 1.5, something like that. And you will explain the subject and what we are talking about. We're going to talk about.
Sounds good. I'm getting a host disabled screen sharing, so can you?
Oh, okay. 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 Now I think you can.
Aha.
Okay.
Excellent. All right then. So hopefully you see my screen, and so thanks, Shlomi, for that. I didn't understand a word of it, but so the remainder will be in English. And so we are here to talk about sharing content in the Power BI service and the options we have to do that securely. From left to right, because Shlomi and I were just talking about how Hebrew is a right to left language. So I kind of chuckled because I knew I had a left to right agenda coming in. But anyways, we're going to start out with just a super quick overview. Then we're going to walk through in steps 2 through 5. We're basically just going to walk through some of the different options that we have in the 2 types of workspaces, sharing and apps. And then we're going to try to pull together some of the things that we talked about in a strategies and suggestions section at the end. Everything I talk about will have a primary focus on security. Questions, I will stop at the end of each one of these sections for questions. We'll also have a little bit of time at the end. I do not have the YouTube chat open. So Shlomi, I'm going to rely on you to, when we pause, let me know what kind of questions there are that we want to handle.
Okay.
I also want to mention that this is a pretty fast moving, mostly intermediate session. I will have to state a few fundamental or beginner statements just to make sure we're not too far out in the weeds, but I certainly am not covering all the fundamentals in detail. So if you need me to pause and elaborate on something more, just let me know. And also, if you would like a copy of these slides, the website is at the bottom of the page here on the presentations page. You can go grab a PDF there. As he mentioned, I'm Melissa Coates. I'm self-employed. I'm a little bit different from most Power BI people in that my specialty area is in governance and administration type of topics, far more so than development type of topics. I do have a background in data warehousing and business intelligence systems. I just don't spend a lot of time doing the hardcore development work today. So these days I spend most of my time doing two things. One is technical writing for Microsoft. And the latest thing that we have published is called the Power BI Adoption Roadmap. There's a link here if you want to go grab it. There's also a thing called the Enterprise Deployment White Paper. It's currently over 1.5 years old, but guess what? I'm actively working on updating it now. So in the coming weeks and months, we'll have a new version of that, which is pretty exciting. And then the other big thing that I'm spending most of my time on right now is an online course. It's on my website. I'll let you check that out if in fact you are interested. So let's jump into it. First, I want to do a very brief overview and talk about terminology. We have two types of workspaces in which to store our content, my workspace and just a standard or regular workspace that used to be referred to as app workspaces. And Microsoft dropped that app prefix, I think, because a lot of customers found it a little bit confusing. The primary purpose of a workspace is to store content and to store our artifacts. And by artifacts, I mean things like our reports and data sets, but it's a lot more than that. It's also about facilitating collaboration. And so what I'm depicting here is we might have a data set owner that's working on that and publishing it up to a workspace. You might have somebody else that's working on reports and publishing that up to a workspace, and somebody else, the third person on the right, helping with data validations and quality assurance and all of those types of things. So we have data storage, we have collaboration, and we have what I tend to think of as content distribution for small teams. And all I mean by that is people that need to view content can do so directly from within a workspace. And we usually say that that's best for small teams because it's a less formal process than apps. So we'll look at more of that later, but those are our three main purposes. Now, when we're talking about the term sharing, it gets a little bit difficult sometimes because sometimes people refer to it very generally. And in fact, the session title of this presentation refers to sharing very general, but it's also a very specific feature in the Power BI service where we share one report or one dashboard with someone else. So when you're talking to people, you kind of need to figure out, are they talking about the specific feature or are they just speaking about it in general? The term distribution, you just heard me say that one of the main things we can do with a workspace is content distribution for small teams. And that's just a general term for delivery of content. And by the way, this is directly from the Power BI team. This is not something that I have made up the way that I see the world. Third, collaboration. That's our term just for when people work closely together. This is sometimes just done by alternating sharing a Power BI desktop file, but it's also done in a workspace. So when it comes to viewing content, we've got our two kinds of workspaces. we've got sharing, and that is on the right, the specific feature that I'm referring to. And then we've got apps. So as we go through this session, we're going to explore more of the specifics for each one of these items. So by the very end, one of the big takeaways that I want you to have is that my workspace is suited to personal BI. Regular workspaces are suited to team collaboration and small team distribution. Sharing is something that we want to handle on an individual case basis, and I'll elaborate on that more as we go through the session. And apps are what we're going to use for more of our broad content distribution. So kind of those takeaways are what we're driving towards at the end from a big picture scenario. Are there any questions we want to tackle before I dive into my workspace?
Okay, meantime, no question asked.
Sounds good. A lot of these, we are going to actually start out with a demo. And so with my workspace, a couple of things that I really want to emphasize is that when we're in my workspace, and I'm logged in as a user named Peyton, so that's why you see that name instead of my name, really just one person can access the content in this workspace. And yes, they're sharing, and yes, we will get to that, but only the owner of this content can actually manage it and edit it. And so that's a real core concept to using my workspace. And so if the alternative is just sharing PBIX files on a file system, this is still a very, very good step forward. Now, I can create content in here if I want to, with the exception of data flows. We can't do that here in my workspace, but otherwise I can do most other things that I can do in a standard workspace here in my workspace. Now, a couple things that I would like to propose to you is that really the best uses for my workspace is that it's truly personal content, or you're doing a proof of concept or some sort of temporary analysis, learning, things like that. And that's because what we don't want in my workspace is mission critical content. And that's really back to that whole idea of only one person can manage the content there. Even though you could share out of my workspace and other people could view it, only one person can manage it. And that fundamentally represents risk. And although you could access the original PBIX files elsewhere if there was a really sound process for where that original content is located, we all know most people aren't quite that explicit in their process of where originals are stored versus where it gets published. So first takeaway really is just, let's not use my workspace for the mission critical content. Where we want that content is in standard workspaces. And stop me if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to pop over to look at a couple of things here before we talk concepts. So in our standard workspaces, I still want to qualify them, since they dropped that app workspace term. I still want to, but in our workspaces that aren't my workspace, we can do all sorts of things. We can hopefully name them accordingly. Like, for instance, you see I've got a sales prefix on each one of the ones listed here. They have a consistent logo, things like that. We can get into doing things like separating out dev, test, and prod, which has a influence on how we handle security as well, because only production would have everyone that needs to see it have rights. Dev and test usually is a much smaller set of people. And then the other big thing that we can do, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more here in a moment, is this idea of separating out data and reporting workspaces. And it has a very big impact on how we want to handle security. Once we're in one of these regular workspaces, we see that the, whoops, hang on, let me switch to one. We see that the owner reference changes to just the name of the workspace. I actually kind of wish they didn't use the term owner here, but that's beside the fact. The other thing that I want to mention at this point is every workspace has this idea of a license mode, and whether or not it's a pro workspace or a premium per user workspace or a premium capacity workspace does influence who's allowed to access it. The big one being, if you haven't started down your journey of premium per user, if you've assigned a workspace to premium per user, every other user that views that content needs to have a PPU license. That includes if reports are over in another workspace, you can't do things like, oh, I've got a data flow in a PPU workspace and the downstream data set, and then the downstream report from that is in a pro workspace. Once you start PPU, everything user-wise and artifact-wise stays PPU.
You cannot mix the license.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Whereas you can more so when we're dealing with premium per capacity. It's just the PPU that's very, very restrictive there. And that's worth mentioning because it's not exactly security, but it is user access. So it's certainly related. And then within these workspaces, we have 4 different roles, which we'll review more here in just a moment. But we've got our admin, our member, our contributor, and our viewer. And in this example, I'm showing how I've actually set up Active Directory groups. And so Azure Active Directory is always the underpinning underneath Power BI and everything Microsoft really. And so in terms of users and groups, we're integrated with that. So these are all groups from there, which are integrated. For some companies, that works out really well. In the vast majority of situations when it comes to self-service BI, that's probably not achievable. It really depends on what your process is to go get a user added to a group. If it's super easy, very fast, then absolutely use groups whenever you can. But in most self-service cases, that isn't always a realistic goal. While we're on the topic of workspaces, the other thing that I want to mention, if we go into the admin portal, there is a workspaces page. And if we go into the options for any workspace, the thing that I want to mention is that any of your Power BI administrators are able to adjust the permissions for a workspace, even if they don't have workspace access to begin with. So what that means is you want to be very, very cautious with who's allowed to be a Power BI administrator, because not only is it a very high privilege role from managing the entire user experience, all the tenant settings and things like that, but any of these workspaces, not my workspace and not the old classic workspaces. So just the new workspace experience, the access can be changed by an administrator. Now it's all logged and that kind of thing. So 99.9% of the time, nothing's happening that shouldn't be happening, but it's still a best practice to minimize who your administrators are, because it's so high privilege with regard to the ability to adjust permissions. So you heard me say a moment ago, this idea of separating out data workspaces and reporting workspaces. So let's explore that for a second. On the left, we see at the top left, a data flows workspace, and at the bottom left, a data sets workspace. And then on the right, I have reports and dashboards over in what I refer to as a reporting workspace. And this really supports the fact that we usually have different people who develop these types of content when we get into bigger teams and bigger organizations. So what we want to do So we want to start thinking about, well, who are our data authors? And I simplified this to get rid of the data flows workspace, but who are our data authors and what they would need to get their job done after they're done creating the data set in Power BI Desktop and they're ready to publish it up to the service. What do they need? They need a workspace role, and they need either admin member or contributor. Our report authors is slightly different and just a tiny bit more complicated. For them, they also need a workspace role, but for them, it's down on the report workspace. And they need one more thing. They need the build permission on that individual data set, which allows them to create new content from the data set, but not actually edit the original data set. And if you've ever had a situation where everything's in one workspace and a report creator says, I promise I am not going to mess with the data set, I'll only create reports. And then small teams that might work perfectly fine. But when we get into slightly more critical situations or larger teams, this kind of setup helps to be able to separate out that sort of thing. So it gives us clarity on who's allowed to edit and who's allowed to view, both from the, strictly the permissions management aspect, as well as the roles and responsibilities aspect. So we are no longer over provisioning permissions, and we're not relying on the honor system of somebody to say, no, I promise I am not going to update that data set. I'll leave it alone. And then this third one is a very big deal. If you need row level security to work when you are getting data from the data set, and even for the report author, row level security will actually work in this situation because they only have build permission on this data set. They don't have edit permission. And so that alone is a really big advantage. A few days ago, I just published a blog post, and in a moment here, the URL will pop up at the bottom left. But there's a lot of things to think about when workspace planning. And since this is more of a security session, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to highlight the ones that are security related. And so planning criteria number one really is all about what's the content. The first thing we're always thinking about is the fact that our workspace is a subject area boundary and a boundary for how sensitive is the content and who's it delivered to. Here's where we start also getting into a security boundary. Who are we delivering it to? And we talk about that as being content delivery scope. That's actually a term from that Power BI adoption roadmap with the link that is at the beginning of these materials. And the license mode that we talked about just a few moments ago. And this idea of, well, how do I want to distribute this content via an app? And the reason I mention that is because workspaces and apps have this one-to-one relationship. And so sometimes if we know what we want to end up with on the app, that helps us back into what we want on the workspace side. We also need to think about who's going to own and manage this content. And that does have a security aspect as well. I didn't highlight it and I should have, but who has edit rights to this workspace? And then lastly, how are we going to deploy this content, with a few other considerations that if anybody wants to talk about this more at the end, we can certainly do that. But this kind of highlights the main security pieces. We mentioned earlier there are these 4 roles, and I think of the first 3 roles, so admin, member, contributor, as being mostly to facilitate collaboration, and the viewer to mostly facilitate content distribution. So if we talk about these roles just a little bit more, starting with the admin, our admin is who's able to manage everything about the workspace, including the workspace access or those 4 roles. There's also this interesting little setting that kind of changes what the contributor normal permissions are. And I'm going to elaborate on that in just a second. The next level down, member. So members, admins can do everything that members can do. Members are able to, if we are on row 4 here, they can manage roles, but not for the admins, only for their own level and below. And on, if I do this to kind of help us navigate this screen, on rows 5 and 6 here, members are allowed to publish apps and they're allowed to manage apps. Note that there's not a separate permission to unpublish an app. They are able to share. So we're going to talk here in just a little bit about sharing specifically, what the reshare is, and what these sharing links are as well. So members can do all of that. They can feature the apps on homepage, and they can also deploy from a pipeline if they also have the pipeline access, because pipelines have their own permission. So you need the workspace and the pipeline. And if the workspace is assigned to either premium or PPU. So now we're moving to the contributors. So our third level down, and as you would expect, the admins and the members can do everything. The things that a contributor can now do, this is where we're talking about they can publish, add, edit, delete artifacts. So this is our core permission level for people that just need to publish content. They can also update an app if that special workspace setting is set, and the one, it's the exact same one that we mentioned here. And we'll talk, I'll elaborate on it here in just a couple moments here. Contributors can also feature reports and dashboards, whereas members could do apps as well. So members get more permissions related to apps. We can build and use data sets across workspaces. Basically what this means is the build permission for a data set. Remember that picture we had a minute ago with the data set and the reports that were connecting to it, and they only needed the build permission, that thing, that permission is implicitly granted to contributors and above, whereas anybody else would need that specific build permission on the specific data set. Oh, there's this idea of saving a copy of a report if you want to use it for your own personalized report. That's allowed. And the ability to manage data set refresh and all of that if you're also the data set owner, and if it needs to access through a gateway that you're also in the data source user credentials. There's also this idea of, are you allowed to manage these sharing links that we're going to review here shortly? And that's only if you have a reshare permission. Lots and lots of little things to remember, right? Mm-hmm. The last, our fourth and final role is our viewers. Our viewers can view all content within the entire workspace. And that becomes important when we start talking about sharing, right? If in fact, you don't want somebody to see all the content that's in the workspace because you've defined the scope. Remember, we talked about workspace planning. If somehow now you need to do something that doesn't fit with the scope that you planned for. And then the ability to share workspace content, and I specifically mean the share feature, only if you have the reshare granted on it. And we'll show you that in a demo here in just a little bit. So this thing that I said a minute ago, this unusual thing about updating an app, that's the first of two things that I consider to be kind of exceptions to workspace roles. So in fact, let me just pop over and show it to you for real. If we go back to a workspace, and if I go to the workspace settings and I expand the advanced way at the bottom, there is this security setting that says allow contributors to update the app for this workspace. And that is one way that what would happen is it gives contributors one more inch towards being able to be a member without getting all the permissions that the member is allowed to do. The other exception is a really interesting one. There's a tenant setting called block, republish, and disable package refresh. And what this does is it says only the dataset owner could publish changes to the dataset. So it says ignore the fact that you are a contributor or a member or an admin in the workspace. If you're not also the owner, you can't publish the dataset as well. Here's the thing. My assumption is that one or more influential customers asked for this, got Microsoft to release it, but I think it's confusing because it is an exception to workspace security. It's really only a minor speed bump because if you do have workspace permissions, you can just go take over ownership of that data set. So it's a little bit of a speed bump. The thing that worries me about it is that this thing affects the entire tenant, right? There's no way to apply it to just one group or to apply it to just one workspace. So in general, I don't recommend using it. But if somebody has a great use case for why you do use it, I would love for you to toss that in the chat so we can hear about it. Just a couple more.
By default, it's not activated, but.
By default, it's not activated, right? The data sets would just rely on normal workspace permissions. Now, the odd thing, though, it would make data sets act like data flows. So this is going to change, and it's on the release plan that multiple people will be able to edit and publish data flows. And until we get that, though, what happens right now is if I'm not the owner of a data flow, I can't actually publish changes to it. So data flows are kind of the oddity right now. That's going to come in line so that they act more like the normal data set experience once that release plan item hits. And if anybody's interested in more about that, let us know. And at the end, I'll go pull up the release plan item for you so that you know exactly what I mean and what to look for. The last couple things I want to mention in this section. So we've got this idea of a new workspace experience and the classic workspaces. The classic workspaces are those ones that we've had since the very beginning that are tied with those Microsoft 365 groups. The new workspace experience has all sorts of new capabilities. As you can see here, lots more flexibility for how we can assign permissions. So 2 points here. One is, if you still have a lot of classic workspaces and you don't have a plan in place to start cranking through those upgrades, you want to do that because by the time we get into 2022, there was a date on one of the blog posts recently and it escapes me, but there's going to be the forced migration come in 2022 that Microsoft has said. And we would rather do this on our own in a little bit more controlled way. The other thing is that the new workspace experience, we say, hey, this is great. We get all these other ways that we can use to secure our workspaces. And that's fantastic. I love it. But not every single group type is supported for every type of permission in Power BI. Big example is Microsoft 365 groups. We can't use them for sharing. So in general, if we're kind of looking across the whole landscape of every single type of permission that we can do, in general, you know, our two kinds of security groups are going to have the most coverage. So just a heads up there. Just a couple things to watch out for as we wrap up this section. One, too many people who can edit content in a workspace, it equals risk. I remember once I sat down, I'm looking around at something in a client's Power BI environment, getting to know what they have there. And I see 50 some admins in a workspace. And, you know, that just, that makes me freak out a little bit. So kind of think about that in terms of if it's a highly collaborative workspace and it's not critical, okay, I'm not nearly as worried. But depending on the type of content and who's really relying on that content, you want to be really careful about how you set those roles. You also want to think about if we have these big, massive workspaces that have a lot of unrelated content, what that means then is we have to start relying more on things like sharing on individual items, more so than the easier to manage workspace roles. So I personally lean more towards let's have more workspaces that are suitable to the purpose, as opposed to saying, oh, let's have one workspace for everything the operations team could ever need, that kind of thing. All right, let me pause there because I just threw a lot of stuff at you. Any comments or questions in the chat that we want to touch on before we keep moving?
Let's see. No, it's quiet. It's
All
quiet on the
right.
chat. Yeah.
Y'all are taking it easy on me. Okay. All right. So sharing does have its place. I'm going to knock it around a little bit here in this section, but it is an important feature. Let's start with, before we do a demo this time, let me first talk a little bit about the two kinds of sharing because it changed a whole lot this past year. We now have two kinds of sharing. We have shown on the left this idea of sharing links. And then on the right, we have this idea of just direct access sharing. And that's the one that we've had for years now. Direct access is just kind of the regular sharing. If we think about these links, there are three kinds of links that we have now. The first one is people in your organization. And we're going to take a look at this here in a second. This one is the default. There is specific people, and that's where you would quite literally list out users and groups that have access, as opposed to anybody in your organization that has the link. Mm-hmm. This third type, people with existing access, doesn't actually create a new link. It just generates a URL that you can send to somebody. So this one's really mostly just a convenience, whereas this first one and this second one are true links. So let me show you what I mean by that.
Specific people, it's also outside the organization. Or just in my organization, the specific people or group.
I need to double check my notes.
Okay.
I think sharing links do not work outside of the organization, and you'd have to use direct access sharing. Mm-hmm. For your guest users. Those would be your B2B users from Azure Active Directory. Mm-hmm. I got to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that that's right.
Okay.
All right, so if I start in my sales analytics workspace, and if I just go to, for instance, this call center stats report, and I hover on it, the very first thing that we see is the sharing button. And it's also prominently displayed if we are viewing a report. So one thing that happens all the time is people that are newer to Power BI, they discover sharing right away because it's very prominently displayed. And it's much more easy to find than workspace security or apps. So it tends to be overused before people learn, oh, there are these other alternatives. But if we hit this sharing button, this is the new sharing experience. And so you can see now that if we click that button, sending a link instead of that direct access sharing is now the default experience. So if I click this right here, the default is people in your organization. Guess what this really means? This means anyone in your organization who has the link can view the content. I strongly wish that that was not the default, and that the default was really that you assign excuse me, that you assign specific people. So specific people, the third one listed, is the one that you want most of the time. So if you kind of get yourself in the habit of just using that one, so yeah, okay. The other thing to know is that by default, these other two items down here are selected. The first one is allow recipients to share this report. That is granting a reshare permission. So no longer are you in total control, you as in somebody with workspace permissions, in total control of who has access to this content. So control freak that I am, I'm usually deselecting this first one. And then the second one is allow recipients to build content with the data associated with the report. So that goes and it finds the data set underneath this report that we started with, and it grants a build permission on that specific data set, which means in addition to being able to view this report, you can now go start creating your own reports on the underlying data set. And that's a great convenience, but again, it's selected by default. So it's very, very easy to just very quickly give people more than they really need. All right, so that's my experience when I just hit the sharing button. Now, to get to actually view what are the existing permissions, so I can get there a couple of ways. If I hit this little ellipsis at the top and choose manage permissions, I can get there that way. Or I tend more commonly to use the regular menu here on the item and just choose manage permissions this way. And here's where we get to where we now have these 3 pages. We've got the new links, we've got direct access, and then we've got pending. So this link, if we talk about this one first, this is a specific people link, and it granted read and build permissions. And if I look at the gear here, I can see that Edward and Sadie both have access to this link. It does not have the reshare selected. I hovered on it, so it looks like it is, but it's not. But it does have build selected. So that's why it says here, read and build. Now, if I were to add one more link, and if I choose specific people again, and if I choose one with, how about we deselect both of these, and I hit apply, and I say, who do I want to use real quick? Here, I know he's in the other one, but that's okay. Just so I can get the link to create. All right, here's the thing that I want to point out. I have 2 links now. The first one's read and build, the second one's read. If I start looking at these lists, it looks like only Edward and Sadie can use this link. But guess what? This first link is more powerful than this second link. So what really happens is if Sadie got sent this link right here, even though she's not on this list, that link would work for her. And that's a way for Microsoft to try to make it less cumbersome as far as all of this link sharing goes. So it's not strictly who's on this list. It's you're on this list or any list for one that is less powerful than the one that you have. All right. Here's direct access. This is the same kind of sharing experience that we've had for a long time. What we see in this window is, let me collapse this guy over here. What we see here is kind of an inheritance of all of the workspace level roles as well. So if we don't have an ellipsis here, right, we can see that these are things that I can't change because it's coming from the workspace and so forth. Then I've got some other individual ones. If I click one of the ellipses here, I can add reshares. Here's somebody that's a viewer, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the one we've had for a long time. Now pending, this is interesting. So let's play pretend that for this particular report, I'm going to go to a different window where I'm logged in as a different user. It's basically a private window. And I'm going to go to, let's say somebody sent him a URL and he doesn't actually have access to this content. What's going to happen if I'm logged in as Scotty? Scotty is going to try to view this report. It's saying, you know what? You don't have access. And in a moment here, it's going to start. There we go. It's going to start the workflow for requesting access. And this is intended for exactly these kinds of situations, right? Person A sends a link to person B, not realizing that person B doesn't even have access. So, you know, he says, hey, I need this because of, you know, blah, 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 blah. A beautiful detailed message of why you need access. And if we send that request, the owners of the report are gonna get this. Now, if I go back over to where I was and I refresh this window, my internet's deciding to be slow now. That's wonderful. Well, fine. All right, let's go. Let's go back where I want to be. And we'll go to manage permissions. And what we should see now on the, oh, come on now. There we go, on the pending page. Haha. And here's Scotty's permission. He's asked for read permission. And so here, if I wanted to, I could approve or decline it from here. So all of which to emphasize that sharing, if somebody gets a URL that they don't have access to, a sharing type of operation, if they go through that request workflow, is what is done. So good, bad, or otherwise, that is the experience. So if in fact you're trying to manage through workspace roles, right, then you might decline that pending request and go set up what you want in a different way. Or if you want to grant him access through a group instead of directly as an individual there, that's another reason why you decline that pending request and just go do it a different way. Okay, so you've heard me hint at this. Let me be very explicit when you should use sharing. You want to provide read-only access to one report or one dashboard, as opposed to everything inside the workspace. Or even if you have an app, you don't want the person to see everything inside of the app. So what I want you to do is think of sharing as basically we are creating an exception to the workspace roles. So the workspace role doesn't do it. We want to have an exception for this one individual report, for instance. My workspace, I would say it's suitable when, same thing, read-only access to one report or dashboard, because we have this idea of informal or temporary content that's appropriate for my workspace. And we want to do this part sparingly, which, you know, takes us all the way back to at the very beginning when we said, please don't put mission critical content in my workspace. So things to watch out for, the high maintenance level. And that's because if you can envision, I have 14 reports and I have created sharing links or direct access sharing, either one, for 14 different reports for these sets of people. And you find out Joe is transferring to another department in the organization. So you now need to go change and make sure that Joe can't access these 14 reports. Guess what? You got to go touch all 14 reports. So it can be a great way to be flexible, but can also be high maintenance because it's on an individual item basis. Watch out for extensive sharing, especially for my workspace. Watch out for that default people in your organization that we talked about. Talked about overuse of that reshare permission. That's that default checkbox that just kind of puts control out there where it might be fine and it might not be fine. And then just how you want to handle individuals versus groups. All right, let me pause. Anything that we want to handle before I push on to apps?
Exactly what I want to ask about. If the roles at the level is also influence the apps.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have two things to tell you specifically on that. And one I think you're going to be really excited about if you don't know about it already. So let me start first by just showing you real quick for anybody that isn't super familiar with apps. So I've got my content in the workspace. I've got my items that are set with all the yes, nos to include in the app. So I'm going to go up here to this update app button at the top right. Give it my nice name, description, etc. We set up our navigation, etc. And that can, by the way, include things like links out to a glossary, KPI definitions, even a template, if the same audience of people that's viewing the app is the same audience of people that might be allowed to create a new report from content in there. But where we really want to focus is this third page, the permissions page. So there's two options up here at the top. Entire organization would only be lit up if you have permission to do that in the tenant setting. More often than not, you're going to want to set this up and you can see that I've said, hey, the entire sales team can see the sales analytics app. Then there are these three important boxes. So the first one is, again, tying this idea of who's allowed to view the app with also who's allowed to create content from it. So it's saying, if I have data sets supporting the reports in this app, also grant the build permission. Now, here's the big kicker for this one. If those data sets are in another workspace, because remember earlier we talked about advantages to that. One disadvantage is this nice little one-click convenience to grant build to any underlying data set in this report. It doesn't work if it has to reach into other workspaces. And to me, that's kind of okay, control freak that I am, because then you can go and manage either the workspace permissions or the build permissions for the data sets very explicitly and separate from the app view permissions. But nonetheless, it's checked by default. The next thing that you want to decide is, should users be allowed to make a copy of reports in this app? Most often, now you've heard me talk long enough, you're going to hear me say, I turn it off. And the reason for that is, an app is more of a formal way to distribute content. A lot of times what that means is we have our reports branded. Did we produce them from the central BI team, for instance? Or is this certified? Or is this validated, right? Something to indicate if somebody's looking at this report that I can trust this report. As soon as you start branding reports like that, and you let somebody make a copy of the reports in this app, you've got a problem. So more often than not, I want to let people make copies of reports, etc., through a different way. And then this third choice is allow users to share the app and the underlying data sets. This is basically a reshare permission on the app. Again, Just kind of depends on how critical it is and if you want to allow people to share it as widely as possible, or if you want to keep it more controlled. So those are kind of the highlights of the app itself. So you just heard me say the best thing that we can do with an app is this is our more formal scenarios, right? We've got that nice menu. We can set it up to be just a little bit nicer of an experience for our consumers versus just going to the workspace. The workspace is a little bit more like the kitchen, and the app is a little bit more like the dining room. There are a couple things to watch out for, though. And one of the big advantages that people usually say about apps is that, oh, if I'm working in the workspace on a change to my report, my consumers of the app don't see it until I republish the app. And that's absolutely true for the visuals. But guess what? That's not true for your data set. That's true whether or not we're talking about data refresh running, but it's also true if we're talking about things like you republished the data set and you renamed something, or you changed the calculation, or you changed the relationship. You can break a data set in an app within the workspace. So it's not as decoupled as you think. So it's only really nice for the visuals as a separate layer. The data set, all games are off. So there's that pain point. There's also the fact that we just looked at that demo of the app where we said, hey, what's all the content? We also said, what's the permissions? We are always publishing the content plus the permissions together. There is no way to republish the app just to say, oh, I need to go and add, Shlomi needs access to this app. Let me go add him really quick. If you have content in the workspace that's changing and isn't ready to be republished, you're in trouble. So those are reasons why people usually grow into dev, test, production workspaces. But this is a really lightweight way of doing a development and a production if these particular pain points don't get you. That last one, the app permissions, if you use groups, then you're okay because you would just go add the person to the group and you wouldn't have to republish the app for that purpose. The other thing that I do want to mention really quick, and this is the thing that I thought, if you haven't heard about it, that you might really like, it's this idea of artifact level access. Have you heard about this yet, Shlomi?
No.
Okay, so on the release plan, they call it artifact level access for Power BI apps. So right now, workspaces and apps have a one-to-one relationship, and we can set the permissions for the app. But what happens sometimes is people say, I end up needing to have different combinations of workspaces, and sometimes I have to publish the same content to multiple workspaces to hit these different groups of people. So what they're going to have, if I understand it correctly, they're going to have across the top here, these collections. So here it's showing product team, executives only, and the North America marketing team. And then we're going to be able to basically mix and match that these first 4 reports inside the app are going to be seen by these people.
Oh.
And so it's not, what people have been asking for years is, can I publish more than one app per workspace? And I think this idea of collections inside of the app, is going to accomplish the same thing.
I saw a lot of question about it on all these years.
Yeah, so it's still a ways out. It's still got public preview slated March 2022, and we know some of these dates they hit, some of these dates slip. So it's still a good 6 months out. But we can look forward to it, and that one's pretty exciting.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, so let me wrap everything up with, a few of these you've kind of already heard. So a few final suggestions, and then we can spend any remaining time that we want to spend if there's any questions in there. So the first thing that I want to do is you've heard this in one form or another from me already, but essentially a decision tree. We start out by saying, well, what type of permissions do we need? And if we need edit permissions, we know we're talking about workspace permissions of admin, member, or contributor. If we need read-only permissions, then we have to ask, well, what kind of content are we talking about? If it's more official or formal content, then we would say an app is a more suitable way to distribute this content because it is a little bit more of a formal way to package up these items together. If it's more collaborative content, so less formal, then we say, well, how many items are allowed to be viewed? If we say, well, everything in the workspace is totally fine, then we can say the viewer permissions inside the workspace will be perfectly fine. If I have a group of 5 people that work closely together, there's no need to deal with the extra layer of an app and the extra permissions level if they can get everything they need from a workspace. Let's keep it simple when we can. Then our last choice is if it's only one item or a subset of items, it's not everything in the workspace, then we're talking about using our sharing links or our direct access method. So that's a bit of a decision tree. If we're talking about large teams and more broad distribution, especially for people that you don't even know and you don't work closely together, that's where apps are really much more well suited. If we have a small team, that's where it's either a workspace or an app, depends on what you need. Like we said, keep it simple. Sharing is valid if we've got kind of a small number of people. If you're sharing with dozens or hundreds of people, that just isn't going to feel right. But either way, it should be the last option that we consider, not the first. And we're going to touch on that again here in a second. And if our exact audience really isn't known, that's a good thing where we can start thinking about a template app. Workspaces versus apps. Normally, what we want to think about first, right? These are just rules of thumbs, not hard and fast rules. Normally, we think about, well, the workspace access is mostly just our authors, our developers, our people doing testing and validations, and then apps, that's our read-only consumers, that's our viewers, right? And then we can simplify from there if we need to. So the way I view the world is my first choice is always an app. It's just the best consumer experience. So it's where I start thinking. Now, if that doesn't fit quite well, then I say, well, will the workspace viewer work? Because here we're just talking about read-only viewers, sorry. And so that works really well for small teams, like we mentioned. And then our third choice is this idea of individual item sharing. And the reason that I wanted to really mention this is because a lot of times people tend to start out with sharing as being the first way that you attack things. And mentally, I like to change that to being third, right? It's got its purposes, but can we do it third? If we're talking about managing permissions for our authors, we touched on this earlier. We've got our workspace role, and hopefully just for data-oriented workspaces. Our report authors have the 2 pieces, the workspace role and then the build up on the data set, which incidentally, the build on the data set wouldn't be necessary if it were all in one workspace, because if the report author already has contributor, member, or admin, the build is already implicitly included. Now, that build, though, in addition to allowing them to fire up Power BI Desktop, say I want to choose a data set that already exists and use that as my source. It lets you do that from a new report perspective. It lets us use Analyze in Excel, which is basically the same conceptual idea, just from Excel instead of desktop. And it also lets you connect to that XMLA endpoint if you're in Premium or a PPU workspace. So Build kind of allows you to connect to that data set in these multitude of ways. And so we can directly acquire build from the data set permissions, if in fact we go in and look at that, and I didn't show that in the demo, but I can if you want me to, indirectly, and you've seen this already in the demos a couple times, if you're sharing a report or a dashboard, if you're publishing an app, or with the workspace roles that are above viewer, build is just indirectly or implicitly already granted. Now we haven't spent any time on row level security yet. And so I'm not going to dive into it. With row level security, what we're talking about is if I'm looking at a report and I can only see the rows come back or the data that's associated with the department I work for, and Shlomi's we're viewing the same exact report, but he can only view the data associated with his department, that's row level security in action. And so let's say that I've got data set 1 shown down here on the left, and I have not set up any sort of row level security roles in this data set at all. When I publish that up to the service, anybody who's got view permissions to that, so here we're probably talking viewer on the workspace with no row level security, the viewers are going to see all of the data in that data set by default. Now, let's say I've got data set 2 at the bottom right. Let's say I've got at least one RLS role. When I publish that data set, because it has at least one role, any of the viewers have to be in a role to see anything in the data set. So a lot of times what people will do is essentially use RLS as another layer of security. So if workspace security or sharing gets a little bit out of hand for one reason or another, you got to also have the RLS, which might be tightly controlled by, somebody else, because this behavior, if RLS exists versus not, is entirely different for your viewers. And then just to kind of cover the editors for a moment as well. By editors, I mean any of those people in the workspace that have contributor, member, or admin. So they can edit the data set. RLS will always be ignored for them. And so regardless of if you got data set 1 or data set 2, if you can edit the content in the Power BI service, RLS will always be ignored, and those people will always see all of the data in either one of these data sets.
So RLS will be working on a viewer only.
Mm-hmm. You got it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Viewer only.
Viewer only.
Yep. And so we always like to think of RLS as being defined in Power BI Desktop and invoked in the service for people that have view only permissions. All right, so way at the beginning, we said that my workspace is good for personal BI. And we said that the other workspaces are good for team collaboration and small team distribution viewership. We said sharing is a way to distribute content individually. Whoops. And that apps are our way to handle more broad content distribution just because it's got that, menu and it's a little bit more of an elegant solution. So that's kind of where we started. There's this other thing that is, I just refreshed the diagram on my website. So if you want a PDF of this, we have not talked about every single piece of this diagram, but this is kind of a high level bird's eye view of permissions that are managed by authors. And by that, we're usually thinking about our self-service authors and creators. There's more to it, especially when we bring administrators into the picture. But this is the big picture. I do want to point out, since it's October 18th right now, This right now, this goals is still just a placeholder. It's on the release plan. I thought it was due last month, but this is what they say is coming. So I went ahead and gave it space, but it's not technically landed yet. So it's consider that one a placeholder until it lands. And with that, we can handle any Q&A that's open. And at the end here, I've got a few links. If you joined us late and you missed where to download the slides, that link here is up here at the top left.
Okay. You mentioned the goals. What they are? What are they?
Oh, well. So goals, if I go, let me remember which workspace I tucked those into. Hang on, maybe I was in the right place. One second. Hang on, I'm having a moment. There we go. So we've got this newer capability of goals. So scorecards are basically a new artifact type. Oh, I put it in executive metrics. Okay. So I've got what I call my executive scorecard. And so it's basically an easy way to try to track key performance indicators. I have not worked with these a whole lot yet. Oh, look, my goal is at risk, darn it. But that's what those are, and some more permissions are apparently coming.
Okay. So it's referring the use of the each viewer or contributor of the reports, or it's regarding the usage of the reports.
Can you say that again?
The goals, it should be it's referring the use of the viewers of the reports.
Yeah, I think so. I have not spent an awful lot of time with them yet, but I don't believe that they're following Workspace permissions entirely. I'd have to double check that though to be sure.
Okay.
So don't quote me on that one.
Okay. Okay, let's see if we have any question on the YouTube as well. Okay. Okay, there's no question. I think it was very, very clear. So great.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me. This was fun. It's a new session, or highly redesigned from one that I haven't touched in about 1.5 years. So so I appreciate you letting me give it a run.
Thank you very, very much, Melissa. It was very interesting and it's very clear. There's a lot of material on this subject. So I think yes, this is the link to the slides. Yeah,
you got it.
Okay, so maybe we can put it underneath the recording on the YouTube channel. Okay, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Shlomi. Appreciate it.
Thank you. תודה רבה לכל הצופים שהיו איתנו עד עכשיו, ונתראה בוובינר הבא. אוקיי? אז תודה ושיהיה המשך ערב נעים. Have a nice evening all and have a nice day, Melissa.
You too. Take care.